Great. Hello, good morning. Welcome. I'm so excited to have everyone here to join me this morning. Let me just share my screen. Great. Wonderful. Great. And I want to start. Welcome everyone as you are coming in. We're really excited to have you here to chat a bit more about strategic code compliance. To get us started, I'd really love to invite everyone to share in the chat, what are the goals of your city's code enforcement program? What do you use code enforcement to try to accomplish? I'd love it. So you are welcome to share your name, where you're from, but just in the chat, if you could put a few words for, what are the goals of your city's code enforcement? Beautification, money, that's really interesting. Health, safety, welfare, that's wonderful. Minimum maintenance standards, education, revitalization, I love it. Getting properties into compliance. Mia, sustaining that aging, preserving housing stock. I like to see that. Safety, health. These are great answers. This is really wonderful. Thanks all. Preservation. That's wonderful. So you all, thanks so much. Great answers. And this is what we like to see. And you're really hitting on what we hear from communities and leaders across the country. The goal of code compliance is not usually about, just getting those fines and fees. It's really about caring about the health and safety of housing and of neighborhoods. It's about improving property conditions, stabilizing neighborhoods, preventing properties from deteriorating to the point that they need to be demolished, and preserving that housing and building stock. So as you can see, we're all here for these reasons because we care about our communities, our neighborhoods, and the folks that are living in our communities and our neighborhoods. So my name is Libby Benton, and I serve as Senior Counsel at Center for Community Progress. I'm an attorney who's been working in the housing and community development field for about 15 years, and I've spent the last 3 years at Community Progress working on our technical assistance team, which means I've had an opportunity to travel across the country and work with everyone from code inspectors on the ground to local elected officials to leaders in departments in local governments and regionally on ways to address vacant and abandoned properties. And today I'm going to talk to you about how what we call a new approach, what we call strategic code compliance, can offer a more equitable, efficient, and effective way to bring properties into compliance with housing and building codes than more traditional one-size-fits-all approaches. So to do that, I'm going to first talk a bit today about the limits of, what we mean by traditional code enforcement and what the limits of that approach are. Then I'm going to talk about what we mean by strategic code compliance and how your community could take steps to shift from a traditional approach to this more strategic approach focused on compliance. Then I'm going to talk about how a strategic code compliance can be applied to address 3 common problem property types: vacant properties, rental properties, and owner-occupied properties. Then I'm going to try to save a little bit of time at the end for question and answers. So please, throughout the presentation, I really want to be responsive to your interests and your questions. And I know we have a big day of webinars, so I want to keep this as engaging as we possibly can. So please put those questions in that question and answer box, use that. But also feel free, if something's resonating with you, feel free to mark that in the comment, share that in the comments. And we're not always the experts. If you know of a great example of something, feel free to share it in the comment box. Let's all learn from each other. So share what's been working well in your community or the challenges that you have. And let me see. Oh, and finally, the resources. In that resource tab, there's going to, my colleague Julia behind the scenes is going to be sharing some of our great publications from our organizations and others that can go more in depth into these issues. And then we're also going to be sharing links to some of the examples from other communities that I'm going to share along the way. I think that's everything. Okay. Now, before I get started, I just want to do a little level setting to make sure we're on the same page. So when we're talking about code compliance or code enforcement, we're really focusing on housing and building code enforcement on existing properties. So the enforcing minimum property maintenance standards. And in the communities where that we help and that we work with, there are kind of usually two buckets of concerns. So we can use this picture at a right as kind of like a highlights magazine search and find. You know, can you spot the code violations that most communities are concerned about? And so on the exterior, you know, there's two buckets. One is those on the exterior, and those are the types of code violations that are really causing harms to neighbors and neighborhoods. Those, as Odetta talked about in the first session, you know, those are driving down property values, increasing the likelihood, can contribute to increases in crime and decreased neighborhood safety. So those include things like high weeds and grass, dumping, broken and missing windows that allow people to get into these unsecured structures. Also roof damage, peeling paint, those kind of exterior violations that are going to allow properties to deteriorate more quickly, and other things. But then also there's another bucket that you don't see when you're just driving by, and those are interior code violations, and those can have, you know, we're especially concerned about those and the effect that they have on the health and safety of tenants that lives in those properties. So that can be a lack of heated hot water, rodent or pest infestation, lead hazards, sewage backup, water damage, and electrical hazards. So these are the types of code enforcement, or sorry, code violations that the communities we work with are usually most concerned about when we're talking about, you know, improving the effectiveness of code enforcement and code compliance. So now I'm going to talk about traditional code enforcement, what we mean by it, and what are some of the limitations. So when we say traditional code enforcement, what we're talking about is an approach to code enforcement that is usually reactive, that relies primarily on complaints to identify code violations, and then overwhelmingly uses civil and criminal penalties, or the threat of civil and criminal penalties, to try to get owners to bring their properties into compliance. And finally, it's an approach that uses these same tools on all properties, you know, regardless of the owner property or neighborhood type. And to be clear, traditional code enforcement works in many situations, especially in stable housing markets and when the owner of the property has the incentive and the resources to make repairs. And relying on complaints can be a way to allocate limited resources. And so we're not saying that it doesn't work in all situations. It's just that there are certain limitations, especially in the types of places we work with that have weak real estate markets, high rates of vacancies, and owners that often don't have the resources to make the repairs. So in those types of cities and neighborhoods, that's where the limitations of traditional code enforcement are most apparent and where there's the biggest need for an alternative approach. So to show what the limits of traditional code enforcement are and why your community should consider moving to a different approach, I'm going to use this example house here. So if you have joined this webinar, I am guessing that you have some properties that look a bit like the one in this picture. And if you're using a traditional approach to code enforcement, the way that you're usually going to hear about a problem at this property is through a complaint, right? Here is a neighbor giving a call in. And when you get that complaint, you're going to go out, do an inspection, maybe send a warning. If that doesn't work, you're going to send a violation notice. Fix this up with this many days and you're going to have this high penalty. Now, for a property that looks like this and maybe has been vacant and abandoned for several years, is that citation going to get it, brought up to code? Probably not. So under a traditional approach, the next step is usually something like, going to the legal department and filing a court action and a local administrative hearing, or taking it to a local district or circuit court for to try to get damages or an order for the owner to comply. So in your experience, is that going to work? Probably not. Oftentimes, these actions are filed against the owner of the property. And in many cases, these vacant and abandoned properties are owned by LLCs or out-of-state companies, or in some cases, heirs or people who are deceased. And so oftentimes these citations and these letters are simply returned to sender, or in the case of LLCs, just simply ignored. So no one pays, no one fixes the property, no one shows up in court. So even if you go through the court case and you can win by default, or even sometimes if an owner is willing to show up and you get a judgment against them, you have a judgment against them for money damages that you might try to collect. And you might even try to add it as a non-priority lien against the property. And someday, if that property is sold and it actually sells, and if it's sold, maybe the city will get paid off, but that lien is going to be last in line behind everything else: old mortgages, judgment liens, back taxes. So the chances of seeing that money are slim to none. So, this is what a traditional approach usually looks like. But it usually doesn't stop there because this approach hasn't brought the property into compliance. So what usually happens next is more complaints. In this case, it looks like maybe this gentleman is a city council member or alderman. Why hasn't this been fixed up? If your city is relying only on a traditional approach, then you only have those traditional tools to use again and again. So more citations, more court cases, more non-priority liens against the property, and the cycle just continues. And we have worked with communities where this cycle is continuing over years and years. And as you can see, the property is not getting in any better condition, and often it actually gets in worse condition. So in our example here, the grass is starting to grow up, nothing's happening, people are starting to dump tires and other debris. So why is this a problem? So first of all, and most obviously, it's not effective. This is not resulting in the property being brought into compliance. It's just not providing an incentive for the owner to bring it up to repair the property. Second, it's not efficient. Every single one of these icons represents a lot of your staff time and resources devoted to going out and doing the inspection, re-inspecting, getting ready for a court case, doing the paperwork to attach to the lien. That's a lot of resources for not a lot of results. And finally, it's not equitable. We know that because of the history of racist policies and practices that Crystal and Odetta talked about in the first session, that vacant and abandoned properties like this one are disproportionately located in communities of color. So if you're repeatedly on and on again using an approach that's not reducing the harms caused by those properties to neighbors and neighborhoods, you're having a disproportionately negative impact on those communities. And second, the other issue is that if this home was owned by a low-income, resident, if this was an occupied property and the owner just simply didn't have the resources to make the repairs, focusing on civil and criminal penalties, getting them into court, getting liens against their property is only going to make it less likely that they're going to be able to have the resources to make the repairs. So what is a better approach? First, I want to go back, and I did want to share, I wanted to be sure to say that I want to make clear that we're not saying that if your community is using a traditional approach that you're doing a bad job or you're at fault. I was just talking to a code enforcement, the head of a code enforcement department in a small town who'd been a code enforcement officer for 20 years and was now the head of the department. And she was saying, Libby, we use a traditional approach. And it's not that we're doing a bad job. We're doing a really good job. We're out there for our community. We're responding to problems. It's just that it's not effective. We just need to do something different. So we just need a different approach. So I want to be clear that we have a ton of respect for the great job being done on the ground and by leaders in this space. And that we just want to help share some ideas that can help you use your limited resources more effectively to get the results that I know that you all are the first people that want to see that. Great, I love the comment. Ready for the better approach. Here we go. So we call it strategic code compliance. And so this is an approach that focuses on really using data to understand your the neighborhood markets, property types, and owner types of each property, and to develop strategies that are going to be most likely to bring those properties into compliance. And it sees the use of civil and criminal penalties as just one tool in a broader ecosystem designed to bring properties into compliance. So there's civil and criminal penalties, but there's also money for home repair, transfers to the land bank. There's a lot more tools that can help bring those properties into compliance. Great. And so we also want to share that this is, cities across the country over the last 10 to 20 years have been making the shift to this approach. And there's probably no one place that's doing it exactly right, but there's a lot of places that are experimenting and innovating. And so hoping to we've really pulled together these kind of 6 elements to help communities make that shift from traditional to more strategic. But really, this is an area that's continuing to develop. So, so here, if you are interested in making this shift, here are kind of the 6 steps that we recommend. So the first is really thinking about how you can use data to inform your code enforcement strategies and the allocation of your limited resources. So a really great example of this is the 2023 City of Cleveland property inventory. So this approach, thinking about data, it's not just about parcel data, like is a property vacant or abandoned, and it's not just about, it's about parcel data, market data, what's happening in the market where this property is located, and social data, data that you're hearing from the community members like Crystal and Odetta heard about. What are properties that are causing most harm that folks are most concerned about wanting to address. So jumping back to the example, in the city of Cleveland partnered with the Case Western Land Conservancy last year to do a survey of over 160,000 parcels in the city. So that's actually every parcel in the survey, vacant with structures or vacant, to document the conditions of those properties. But then in addition to the conditions of those properties, they matched that data to information that they already had about potential lead hazards, whether there was an out-of-state owner, and whether the property was vacant and occupied. And so now the city of Cleveland is in a position to use this data to both inform their individual strategies. So when a complaint comes in about an individual property, they're better able to say what's going to work for this property. Is this an occupied property in a stable neighborhood? Is a warning and citation going to be enough? Or is this a long vacant property where we're going to need to focus on transferring the property to a more responsible owner? And second, they can now use this data to inform the overall focus of their and priorities. Are there certain neighborhoods, where amongst the city can they put their limited resources? So if your city is, taking the first steps and thinking about diving into data, there was a great question about this in the first session, and Odetta addressed this. So gathering data on all of your parcels in your city can feel overwhelming, but as she mentioned, think about academic partners, think about what kind of in-house expertise you might have. If there's some GIS folks that are in different departments that would love to dig into this challenge and help you map this, those can be incredible resources. There's also specialized software programs. The three that we hear cities using most often are Ptolemy, Regrid, and eProperties Plus, that can be incredibly helpful and specialized particularly in dealing with vacant, abandoned, and deteriorated properties. But you definitely do not need specialized software, especially if you're a smaller community with a smaller inventory of property and of properties. So I think one of the links in the resource tab is to some folks in Massachusetts that put together a guide on how you can just use Google Forms and Excel to gather and analyze data on your properties. And as someone put in the chat in the first session, my colleague Alan Malik has this excellent publication, Neighborhoods by Numbers, that walks you through publicly available data sources that can help you determine which properties are vacant, help you understand the neighborhood market strength to inform these strategies. Great. So once you have that data, then it's really important to create the different strategies for different property and owner types, taking into account what's going to be most likely to bring those properties into compliance. And we'll get into what those strategies might look like for each type of property more in the final third of the presentation. But when thinking about the type of property, kind of the major things to think about is the property vacant or is it occupied? So we definitely, when we're talking, we have a specific set of tools that are focused on vacant properties, that are focused on really with the ultimate goal, likely having to be moving it to a new responsible owner. Those are not the tools that we would use for an occupied property. For our occupied properties, we're really thinking about, especially owner-occupied properties, what support can we give to help that owner bring the property up to code, and what can we do to prevent displacement and keep the person in their home. So then also, who owns it? So like even, for example, among rental properties, is it owned by one of these new institutional investors? Or is it owned by mom and pop landlords? These folks are actually my mom and dad who own some rentals. So, are they likely to be more responsive, likely to show up in court, or are you likely never to hear from them again? And, critically, where is the property located? If it's in a neighborhood that has experienced disinvestment for any type of property or owner type, if the market's not there, in many cases, the amount of money needed to bring the property into compliance might exceed the value of the property, versus a neighborhood where there's been some recent investment, and the owners might be more likely to make that investment in the property. Great. So here's a third step that your community can take to shift from traditional to more strategic code enforcement. And that is to really start tracking and evaluating your outcomes of your code enforcement case, both your code enforcement cases and any of the interventions you're doing to try to bring properties into compliance. But if you're using a traditional approach to code enforcement, I think that is a really great place to start, a really great first step. Understanding, of the citations that are getting mailed out, how many are resulting in people fixing the properties right away? How many are you having to file a court case against? How many of those folks are showing up or not, to really understand where are the pain points in your system and where are properties that need a different approach. So we helped, this is a really basic example, but about 10 years ago, we helped the city of Gary do this for their code enforcement process. So, looking at your number of citations mailed, and you can see that 70%, didn't appear in court. 30% just came back undelivered. And so really thinking about for that 70%, which were likely longtime vacant and abandoned properties, coming up with a different approach that citations weren't going to work. But then moving on down here, that, a lot of the folks, the 12% here is, they were owners who didn't have resources. So really trying to understand where the tools that you're already using are working, and what are the types of properties or even specific properties that need a different approach. So the next step to thinking about moving to a more strategic approach is really thinking about how to leverage internal and external partnerships to expand the resources and tools available. So I should have even said this earlier, but obviously the lack of resources and funding is a huge constraint on both the ability for individuals and the cities as a whole to improve property conditions, and for code departments to move to this more strategic approach. And so partnerships are going to be key. So inside a city, is there opportunities to collaborate or coordinate with public health departments, community and economic development departments, land banks if you have one, and then outside of your department, is there an opportunity to partner with social service agencies, nonprofits, religious organizations, to really help bring more resources to bear to work on neighborhood revitalization and bring properties up to code. The really great example of this is Operation Clean Sweep in Buffalo that many of you might have heard of, and many cities have replicated this approach. And Julia can put in some great links to some articles and to the program itself. But they really focus on, focusing on specific neighborhoods and having the city, state, and federal government resources come into those neighborhoods where they're helping neighbors with cleanup of their own properties, the city's making investments and fixing sidewalks, replacing signs, fixing the own city infrastructure, and then going door to door and sharing, health resources from local social service agencies or legal service agencies that can really be brought to bear. So number 5 here is making broader changes to support code compliance, to support the shift to code compliance. So it's really important to have that data. It's really important to think about creating new policies and procedures. But if there's not an overall shift in the goals and the values of the department, you're going to find yourself constantly falling short on implementation. And so it's really about thinking about, shifting from enforcement to getting those fines and fees to thinking about how can we bring all possible tools to bear to bring properties into compliance. So a really great leader in this area is Peoria, Illinois, and Julia can put a link into a great webinar we did with them a couple of years ago, where they talk about how they have made this shift internally. And they said, Joe Doolin, who leads the department, has said it really starts with hiring and training and looking for people that really care about their community, who have really good soft skills and social skills, who are interested in, being out there and working with folks. But then it goes on, to be little things like being out in the community, developing those relationships, having code officers do the good job door hangers, rewarding folks, knocking on doors to introduce themselves. And they have coffee with code, and they even have a fun trash or treat event where you can bring in a bag of trash and get candy in return. So definitely check out those resources. And finally, in making this shift, equity has to be a core principle and a desired outcome. So it's really important to think about as you make a shift to more strategic code compliance, to think about how in the past code enforcement has been used to exacerbate or reinforce existing inequality in your communities. That's oftentimes racial or economic, and really how you can think through your code enforcement system to make sure it's not having those unintentional consequences, and think about how it could instead be used to advance racial equity. So a great example of a community that's done that recently is Louisville, Kentucky. And Julia will put a link into a report that we did with them. So they, as part of a citywide racial equity review, they really wanted to look through their code enforcement system and identify ways that it might be having unintentional consequences of disproportionately harming people of color, and thinking about how they could change those policies. So we did a one-day workshop that included working directly with the code officers to think about what they were seeing on the ground and how things could be changed. And some of the policies they identified were, giving more warnings to low-income homeowners, the ability to waive fines and fees if the properties are quickly brought into compliance, creating a proactive rental code enforcement system to give the officers tools to address rental properties where they were seeing really bad conditions for tenants, and focusing on those chronically vacant and abandoned properties, focusing on getting those moved to new, more responsible owners, rather than just going out again and again and again and citing them. So great, those are some of the 6. So those are kind of some of the steps overall that your community could consider taking to moving to a more strategic code compliance, to a more strategic approach to bringing properties into compliance. And now I'm going to talk about what those, what the strategies look like for some common problem property types. Great. So first I'm going to talk about vacant properties. So we have vacant, rental, and owner occupied. So for vacant properties, the core policy, the core strategy that in the communities we work with that have found effective is what we like to call the fix it up, pay it up, give it up approach. So what this approach means is that when a property has been chronically vacant and abandoned, you're going to still give that owner an opportunity to bring it into to fix it themselves. So send out clear notices, letting them know what needs to be done to repair it. But if the owner is unable to do that, then the city needs to be able to step in and abate those problems, reduce the harm that property is causing to the surrounding neighborhood. So that often looks like mowing the grass, boarding the property, where needed, demolishing the properties, and then seeking to be reimbursed from the owner for those public expenses. So in most cases, we recommend adding those costs as a priority lien against the property, either as a priority code lien or by adding those expenses, the costs and fees to the property's tax bill. And then, if the owner has been unwilling to fix the problem themselves, unwilling to pay, then the city will take action to transfer the property to a new owner. So in the case where it's a priority lien, that's usually through foreclosing and offering the property at a sale. And where you have in states where there are really good code lien foreclosure or delinquent property tax enforcement systems that produce insurable title, that can be enough. More responsible owners might buy those properties at the tax auction and fix them up and return them to the property tax rolls. But in weak housing market and where there's a stronger real estate market, but in weaker housing markets, that's where we see that there might not be that interest at the sale, and the property will get transferred might need some time of temporary public stewardship and something like a land bank. So additional barriers could be removed, like title could be cleared, environmental problems remediated, And then the land bank would be in a position to use that property to meet community needs. And my colleagues, Matt and Brian, later in our VAT Academy are going to talk more about those systems, and will hopefully really be able to see how code enforcement, delinquent property tax enforcement, and land banks can really interact to implement this policy. And I want to say that the local government, more than any other place, the local government's ability to use this tool really depends on what your state law is. So if you want to understand what the fix it up, pay it up, give it up approach can look like, how it would work in your community, you really need to delve into, what exactly your state law tools would be to do this. To do this, you really need to have that authority. The local government needs to have the authority to go onto the property and abate those nuisances, board up the property, mow the grass, and then the ability to recoup those expenses in a way that allows you to transfer ownership of the property as well. So as I mentioned, that could be through delinquent tax enforcement, priority code lien, or something like receivership or an abandoned property proceeding. It might look different in every state. And then what we've really found is that local governments can be hesitant to use this approach if they don't know who the end user is. And so this is where having a land bank can really help make these tools even more effective, because that if the property isn't bought at the sale, if there's no one to take it over immediately, the land bank can operate as a temporary public steward to help really focus on moving that property to a productive reuse. Oh, so going back to our example property. So what would this look like under a more strategic approach? So here we have it. So under the fix it up approach, you would send notice to the owner and see if they would fix it up. If they didn't, then the city would come in and do the repair themselves. So mowing the grass, removing the trash and debris, probably boarding the windows and doors. And then the city would add those costs and fines as a priority lien against the property. And then if the owner is unwilling to does not pay those costs and won't reimburse the city for its expenses, then the city would take action to transfer the property. So in this case, so likely through a code lien or property tax foreclosure. And then boom. And then hopefully it would get into the hands of, the goal would be to get it into the hands of a more responsible owner. And look, these guys are back. Oh no. This time they're saying, wow, it looks really great. Thanks for making this change in our community. And, this is an approach, the fix it up, give it up, pay it up approach is essentially, what many communities are doing across the country in states like Michigan, Ohio, New York, in some places in Missouri, Georgia, that have property tax foreclosure systems that feed into land banks. So many states across the country have been effectively using this approach for 10 to 15 years. So an example is the Tricog Land Bank. They had programs, a specific program where they were obtaining vacant properties through the property tax foreclosure system, selling them to local housing developers who then agreed to rehab them and sell them to first-time home buyers. Okay, great. How are we doing on time? Doing great. So the last two are rental housing and owner-occupied. So for rental properties, the limits of traditional code enforcement really show up in two ways. The first is that in a complaint-based system, tenants are unlikely to come forward to complain about conditions because of their concerns about retaliation and displacement. And then the second way that traditional code enforcement is limited with rental properties is that there are some owners of rental properties that really operate like owners of vacant properties. They're out-of-state LLCs. They can insulate themselves from civil and criminal liability. And so those citations and court actions are going to simply go unanswered. And so this is where you need a better approach. And for rental housing, a more strategic code compliance approach focuses on proactive rental inspections and licensing. So this approach gets at, moves from a complaint base to a proactive. So setting up, requiring landlords to allow regular inspections, usually on a periodic basis, like every 3 or 5 years, so that you're not having to rely on tenants' complaints to get in and see what the conditions of the property are, and to get that owner to bring them up to code. And then the licensing piece is critical, because that allows the local government to take away the landlord's ability to rent out the property, cutting off their stream of income if they're not willing to allow the inspection or bring the property up to code. And that, more than a $500 fine, is the level of incentive that's often needed to get these LLC, out-of-state landlords to bring their properties into compliance. So we have, 4 building blocks that we've identified that I can go through, that are critical to building an effective proactive rental inspection and licensing program. But I want to direct you to the resources tab. There's 2 great publications. One is by my colleague, Alan Malik, Raising the Bar, that talks about designing an effective system. And then the other is by Change Lab Solutions, their guide to proactive rental inspections programs. These are both excellent publications and an essential starting point if you're exploring creating such a program in your community. So kind of the key building blocks that we've identified are, understanding your inventory, creating that proactive rental inspection and licensing program, having effective incentives and penalties to get landlords to participate in these programs and comply with them. So that's both carrots and sticks. So some of the things that, encouraging landlords to participate by allowing longer between inspections for landlords that don't have any code violations. And then really ensuring that you've set aside the resources for enforcement. And sometimes that's going to need to mean affirmative litigation or revoking that license to really get landlords to comply. And finally, tenant protections are really critical, because if you're increasing the enforcement on rental properties, you run the risk, or there will be an increased risk of displacement of tenants if properties are found uninhabitable. So partnering with local social service agencies and providing funding for relocation. There's a great ordinance in Minneapolis where the owner is made responsible, the property owner is made responsible for those relocation expenses. And if they won't pay, the city will front the cost and then can attach those costs as a priority lien on the landlord's property. So here are, the really 2 standout examples of proactive rental inspection and licensing program. The first is in Rochester, New York, and their program really focuses on lead paint hazards. And when we talk about using data to allocate resources strategically, instead of inspecting every rental property in the city, they really focused on pre-1978 properties that are more likely to have lead paint in areas with elevated blood lead levels. And you can see that, this program has been very effective in reducing the elevated blood levels of children. The second example that's often raised up is Brooklyn Center, Minnesota. 2 of the most distinctive things about their program is that it is performance-based, that landlords that don't have code violations, that have agreed to inspections, have longer between inspections. And then also that they have created their own association for responsible management that provides resources to rental property owners and managers, trainings, and has really, helped create a partnership with them. And finally, the last type of problem property, a strategic code compliance approach, is owner occupied properties. So why do I have an expressway here. We use this expressway because we like to call it the core policy equitable off-ramps. So if you're thinking about, when you hear about a violation and you're sending a warning, you're moving towards civil and criminal penalties, with owner occupants, especially low-income owner occupants, you want to think about building in as many off-ramps to that property or for that owner as possible, so that they don't end up having to spend their time in court or their money on penalties instead of on repairs. So those start with, creating robust and identifying robust funding for repairs, sending reminders and warnings, resource handouts, having housing navigators and social workers, if you get to the hearing stage, offering adjournments and working with folks in court, and waiving fines and fees after the fact. One example is owner occupied. One example of this is in Cincinnati. For an example, some of the ways they've built in these off-ramps is providing really clear notices to owners with resource information about how they can get help with home repairs, hiring a social worker to work on their code enforcement staff so that the code enforcement inspectors and officers can refer difficult cases to them, not coming to a citywide agreement that they will not use criminal penalties against owner occupants, and meeting with owner occupants in person at their home. And then in the resources tab, you'll find some links. These are some of the some links to some really great programs that are designed to offer free repair resources and then repair funding programs to owner occupants. So there are many of these programs across the country, but these are some really innovative examples that we've pulled out. So wonderful. Thank you for bearing with me through this marathon session of strategic code compliance. Many folks are asking, I think, in the chat for a lot of these resources, and I just want to direct you to our recent publication, Reevaluating Code Enforcement, where a lot of this information is distilled, and we have a lot of footnotes and links to examples. But now I'd love to jump to the question and answer. Let me figure out how to stop sharing my screen. Great. Hi, Julia.
Hi. Awesome. It's now time for our Q&A section. There's lots of really great questions in the Q&A right now, so we'll get to that in 1 second. I encourage you to keep asking questions. We'll get to as many as possible. And we will have more time for questions at the end of the day when we have our office hours, so I encourage you to return for that as well. I also saw a couple of hands raised throughout the presentation. We're not actually using that feature today, so just if you have a question, throw it into the Q&A. And with that, why don't we start? There was a great question I saw earlier from Jean in Buffalo. When it comes to implementation, how do you recommend strategizing with departments that are already spread thin and reluctant to do things that they view as more work?
Yes, that is a great question. And I think this is a major challenge, especially for someone being up here saying you should do all of these new and exciting things. I think there's two things. I think that, one of the things that you can do is, look together as a department and really quantify two things. One, and it's not just your department, but other key, political leadership and other community leaders, to say, what are those costs of having these vacant and abandoned and deteriorated properties? What are the harms and costs that not doing something is causing to our communities? And I can share, we've done that in some communities, actually helping them quantify that, but you could think through that yourself and even, think through it and even run the numbers on, what are the police calls? What are the, constantly having to go and mow the properties? The costs, there's been stuff on the cost of eviction. So if you're having to dislocate, having to displace owner occupants, what costs do those impose on your healthcare system? That kind of thing. So It's really about thinking about, what are those external costs to make the case for more resources, but then really looking internally about where could resources be shifted. So one example, in Louisville, one of the things they were doing was, every time there'd be a complaint, they would go out, do the inspection, send a warning, send a citation. But they were realizing that there were a few thousand properties that, were just completely vacant and abandoned lots. And so they shifted from, every time there was a complaint, going out and doing that whole rigmarole, to just knowing that those were the properties that they were going to just mow. And so shifting to, not having to spend that staff time on always going out and responding, and knowing that if it was on this list of properties, what they call their cut list, that they can focus more, always giving the proper notices, but focusing more on abatement.
Awesome. Thanks, Libby. Our next question comes from Bailey in Memphis, who shared that they have a local ordinance that allows for the fix it up, pay it up, give it up process, but is still seeing some struggles there in relationship to their land bank. So do you have any suggestions for how we might work with or how they might work with their land bank to more effectively utilize parcels through that process?
Yes, thank you, Bailey. And this is another point that I really appreciate, because I think I probably should have said this more at the outset, but these tools cannot be a silver bullet, especially in communities like Memphis that have very weak real estate markets. Moving the property to the land bank might put it in the hands of a more responsible steward. The land bank might be more likely to get the property mowed or be in a position to use federal funds to demolish it to reduce the harms. But it's not magically, especially in a weak real estate market, going to result in that beautiful, house that I showed for a first-time home buyer. And so I think that sometimes, it's going to have to be part of a larger strategy in your community about attracting that's going to be beyond your code enforcement department and beyond your land bank, about finding those local partners, using, whatever incentives and affordable housing, grants that are out there to focus on redeveloping those properties.
Awesome. Thanks. Sorry, I'm just scrolling through. You guys are sending in questions so fast. It's taking my brain a second to process. There's been a couple along the lines of, and apologies if I butcher your questions together, you guys, about how communities can sort of determine who is able to come into compliance in equitable ways to approach that. If I can look through and find specific wording, but if you have any thoughts on that, Libby.
Yeah, I think that can be really hard because, oftentimes you just get an address. And one piece of it is having, gathered better data about properties. So if you can get that address and you can see that the utilities have been shut off and there's been 25 complaints against this property and the taxes are delinquent, then you know that you're going to be putting that property in a bucket that is focused more on shifting it to reuse. On the other hand, if you have an owner occupied property and you just have that address, you don't know what the financial situation is of that owner. And again, it's, just those are going to be more fact specific. And it's going to be about building those off ramps. So if it's for some reason, a well-resourced local landlord or well-resourced, wealthy local homeowner who's just not willing to make the repairs, then you would, be moving towards that path of enforcement to get them to do it. But really providing those off ramps along the way.
Awesome. We have about 5 more minutes left, so I'm trying to pick out a couple questions. Libby, I don't know if you want to look through if there's anything that's really speaking to you that you think would be really valuable to hear about. Please feel free.
Yeah, let me see.
Yeah.
Maybe as you look, I did want to put in a plug for the Reclaiming Vacant Properties Conference. We have some great panels that are going to be focused on code enforcement, including, I know, on affirmative litigation, examples where cities have used affirmative litigation to address problem property owners, especially owners of problem properties that own large inventories of properties. There's going to be a few sessions on rental registries and rental inspection programs, and really using data to get those off the ground and implement them.
That's awesome. Yeah. And yeah, definitely check out our website where you can find more information about our BP. Early on, there was a question about, could you discuss how priority versus a non-priority lien works?
Yes, and I'm in my colleague Matt might touch on this more in his delinquent property tax enforcement session, but the issue with most code liens under their traditional approach is that when the city gets a judgment against an owner for, say, $1,000 because of the fines and fees and the costs that the cost of doing the abatement action, you can try to go after that owner individually to collect that money, but you're often unable to find them. You can also put it as a lien against the property. But if it doesn't have priority, then it's going to be last in line before whatever other liens are against the property. So that means that property taxes are usually first, and then mortgages, and then whatever else, medical debt that might have got a judgment on the property, a mechanic's lien. And so if the property only sells for $5,000 eventually, those folks are always going to take a bite out of that, leaving no money for the local government to collect when the property's ultimately sold. And then second, a non-priority lien means that you don't have that same power to foreclose. You can foreclose, but you would have to pay off all those people ahead of you to get possession of the property, and that doesn't make financial sense often. So if you can move the code lien to the front, that means that when the city goes to enforce its lien, or if the code is on the property taxes, when you go to enforce that lien, you're first in line, and your foreclosure wipes out all the liens that are behind it. So now that property is in a position where it's being offered up for sale, free and clear of any other liens. And if you have a system where constitutionally adequate notice was provided, it might have even insurable title. So that makes a property much more likely for a more responsible owner to want to buy it, because it would be easier to start to get ownership and title and start rehabbing it.
Great. Thanks, Libby. We have time for one more question, it looks like. So we have this here. How commonly do city governments have the legal basis to implement Give It Up? And what else can a city do as a last resort if they don't have that legal basis?
I would say that it is pretty, let me think. I'm trying to think. So most places that have land banks have this ability, because it's really critical to land banks' ability to acquire properties. So we know that 18 states and Puerto Rico, have land banks. And so I think that at least in those states, there's likely a way for local governments within those states to transfer the properties. But there are states that there are just no good ways to get local control. I'll be honest, that the state laws require, the county to just keep offering the tax liens over and over again, that there's no good ways for local governments to get control for those bad properties. And if you're in that situation, then I think that you really can follow the direction of, those 19 other states and start looking at state law reform to really give you those tools. And this is an area where, in the last 10 to 15 years, folks have been really successful in changing state laws and getting those tools. And we're happy to help you.
Well, that is a really great note to end it on. Thank you so much, Libby, for this wonderful presentation. We are about to go into our lunch break, so I hope everybody has a great lunch, and we see you again this afternoon. If we didn't get to your question, please show up at our office hours and we're happy to answer more questions then. Great. We'll see you all this afternoon.
Great all. Have a great lunch. Thank you.